This program, of course, is presented by Pro Wrestling Illustrated, the most widely read, widely sold, and respected wrestling magazine in the world today.
This is Pro Wrestling Illustrated podcast. I am your host, senior writer Al Castle, with my co-host, Brian Solomon. How are you, Brian?
I am well, Al. How are you?
Good. And both of us trying to stay healthy and safe on what is just an absolutely bizarre week, not just in the world of wrestling, but in the world in general, obviously with the news. The news of the coronavirus has been around for a week, but the spread, and I don't mean just literally, but figuratively, of the news over the last week has been, and over just the last couple of days, has been just really unlike anything we've seen before. And I was just saying before we started recording here, this was a newsworthy week in a lot of ways in wrestling before any of this started to transpire. So a lot to cover, but obviously the main reason we wanted to jump on here is to discuss some of the fallout of the coronavirus. And because of that, I thought it'd be good to have a real reporter type on who could help give some perspective. So we asked Raj Giri, owner of WrestlingInc.com, certainly a friend of the magazine, to join us. How are you, Raj?
Good. How are you guys doing?
Good. And so we're going to be trying to cover it from all angles. I mean, certainly I think at the forefront of the mind of most wrestling fans is WrestleMania and what will happen, whether there'll be a WrestleMania this year, whether it will be a WrestleMania unlike anything anybody's ever seen, a WrestleMania potentially in front of a few dozen or a few hundred fans in WWE Performance Center, or whether it is a WrestleMania in the summer. So a lot to cover there. And also, I guess, just talking about WWE's handling of it and other companies as well over the last few days, maybe some things they did right, some of the things they did wrong, and if we get time for it, some other current events. I mean, we're just coming off of a pay-per-view that in and of itself, Elimination Chamber had a fair amount of news coming out of it. And then, Brian, we had about as big a news story internally for Pro Wrestling Illustrated as you could have pretty much earlier this week with the news from our longtime publisher and editor, Stu Saks, that he is retiring in June. What was your reaction to that?
Well, I mean, it feels like, and of course, this is going to make Stu feel really old, so I apologize in advance, but it feels to me like he'd been, running the magazine since forever. I mean, so I mean, I'm sure he's earned it. God, I have when he started, when he took over as publisher, I was, I believe, still in high school, because I think I have the issue.
No way. In high school you were, well, fair enough. I'm thinking when he joined the magazine. I don't know exactly when he took on the title of publisher.
92 is when he took over as publisher, and I was a senior in high school. And when he took over, when he joined the staff, I have that issue too, but I bought it as a back issue. And I remember he had this really memorable column in there that really stuck with me, because he was taking over, and the name escapes me now, but he was taking over for a writer that really had a strong track record with the magazine. And anyway, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, everybody always called them the after mags and all that, but for the people that were really in the know, and this is no knock on Bill, but I mean, like, for the last 28 years plus, those have been, as far as I'm concerned, the Saks mags, you know what I mean? And so to see him kind of ride off into the sunset, it's the end of an era without a question.
Yeah, it's almost unthinkable that there would be a Pro Wrestling Illustrated without Stu Saks. And when you think about, what I like to call the golden age or the glory days for the magazines from the 80s, really the 70s into the 80s and even into the 90s. I mean, the one consistent has been Stu. He worked alongside the likes of Bill Apter and Peter King and Craig Peters and some of the names that fans of the magazines are so familiar with, and is still punching a clock every day at an office in Blue Bell, Pennsylvania, which I like to visit every so often. I mean, he is still there and has been doing it for now 41 years. So the thought of a PWI without Stu, again, kind of unthinkable. We don't want to dwell on it too much now, because we still have some time. I think he is leaving in June. Also worth mentioning that Kevin McElvaney, who's been on the show here a number of times, a contributing writer for the magazine for a number of years, is going to be taking over as editor. I'm so happy for Kevin. Kevin's a terrific guy, a fan. And that might sound counterintuitive, but the reality is that for a lot of folks who have worked for this magazine and the wrestling magazines for a number of years, it's a job. I mean, I've interviewed some here, especially some from way back when, who kind of acknowledged that their fandom for wrestling maybe wasn't all that strong. It was a 9-to-5 job, and being exposed to wrestling so much as part of your job, you can't help but follow it more closely and get into it. But the reality is some writers have been more fans than others. And I think that's one thing that Kevin brings to the table, which is actually a huge benefit, is that he really does love wrestling, follows it closely, and beyond that is a very good writer. And he started off in the last week or so already working alongside Stu, kind of learning the ropes. And we've already seen some things. I mean, we're up on YouTube, which is something that I wanted to do for a while. So last couple episodes, and I imagine this one as well, it's going to be up on YouTube. So the Kevin era has officially begun. But again, and there'll be more time to do it. And I'm hoping to drive down to Pennsylvania sometime in the coming months. And Brian, I was going to invite you to come with me to maybe record a podcast in person from PWI HQs with Stu and Kevin, kind of looking back and looking forward, so we could give Stu the proper send off. But just to touch on something you said about Stu being somewhat anonymous for so long. I mean, he's a humble, quiet guy, and I think every wrestling fan, I don't want to exaggerate too much, lots and lots of wrestling fans, certainly fans of the magazines, know the name Stu Saks, but a lot of you probably don't know, never seen the guy, right? I mean, he keeps low profile. He's done that intentionally. I had the experience of being with him at a wrestling convention in April of last year, and people were coming by and they were looking at the shirts that we were selling in the magazines and chatting us up, and they'll ask, the guy introduce himself. My name's Bob. What's your name? My name is Stu. And then they'll say, what's your last name? And it's Saks. And then their jaws drop, right? It's like, wow, you're a real person. But not a guy who's gotten a lot of notoriety and deserves it as much or more than I say any living writer involved in the wrestling business.
Yeah, I mean, when I was posting kind of a personal tribute to Stu, just thanking him because he brought me on board the magazine right after I left WWE, and I'm looking for an image of him. I did like a Google image search, and the guy is a ghost. I found one great picture of him from back in the day with Dusty Rhodes, but there was some stupid technical issue. I couldn't attach it. But other than that, I mean, there's nothing. There's just he has succeeded in anonymity. Congratulations, Stu.
He over the years did a few of those WWE documentaries, DVDs for the network as kind of the resident historian. But again, I think I've invited him to this podcast a number of times, and he's always sort of kind of humbly, modestly says, I'm not really good at those things. And has kept a low profile. Now, if you haven't seen Stu, unless you think we're talking about a withering old man or something like that, Stu is in 10 times better shape than I am, and probably any of us on the line here. He has got a lot of life ahead of him, and as much as we'll miss him dearly, I'm glad to see him kind of ride off into the sunset. I got to visit his house last year. Lovely home, lovely wife, lovely dog. Has got a lot to look forward to post Pro Wrestling Illustrated. So cheers to him, and I'm sure we'll be talking about that a lot more in the coming months. Very quickly, let's get the plugs out of the way so we could kind of dig into some news here. The latest Pro Wrestling Illustrated is available now. It is our Decades Awards issue where we look back on, as we do every year in the year in wrestling, we look back on the decade in wrestling. The last podcast here a week ago, we heard from the Wrestler of the Year, AJ Styles. We discussed the various decade awards. Match of the Decade. Did I just call him Wrestler of the Year? I always say that. Wrestler of the Decade, AJ Styles, and all the awards. Match of the Decade, Tag Team of the Decade, Woman of the Decade, and so on and so forth. It is very much collector's issue because obviously we're only going to put those out once every 10 years. So go to pwi-online.com and pick it up right now. You can download it right away, or you can subscribe either to the digital edition or the print edition. Get a deep savings off of the cover price. I don't dwell on it too much, but I looked at it the other day, and I swear it's the same price as it was when I was like in high school, at least for the to get it to the digital edition. So a huge value, especially for everything that's in there. So go to pwi-online.com to pick it up. I'm going to try to keep the plugs shorter than usual here. Find us on social media, Facebook, @official PWI on Instagram and on Twitter. Please subscribe to the podcast. Leave a positive review. I think, as I mentioned, we're up on YouTube now, so you're going to start seeing more of these episodes there. So check that out. And buy the T-shirt, the Pro Wrestling Illustrated T-shirt, available at prowrestlingtees.com. Raj, so let's dig into this. Again, it feels like it's been a year since the Elimination Chamber with all the news of the last week. We're recording this on a Friday evening. It's about 5 p.m. right now. What's your understanding about the latest? Latest I heard is that they're really, it's still kind of still up in the air as far as WrestleMania. Is that right?
Well, and first I got to say, big congratulations to Stu. I sent him an email earlier this week. What a fantastic career. I grew up a huge fan of PWI, and it's funny you guys were mentioning how out of the limelight he stays, because I think he was on a Randy Savage DVD, and I'd been communicating with Stu for many years, and we've talked on the phone and everything, but I'd never seen him until that Randy Savage DVD, and I was like, whoa, that's what he looks like. I had no idea. So
a real person.
yeah, it was wild, but such a fantastic career, and I was a huge fan. So best of luck to him. So influential in the magazine space, but. With WrestleMania, I mean, the Masters. Things are moving so quickly right now with the virus. Things that were postponed hours ago are now being canceled. Things that were going to be played with no fans, like the NCAA, the college basketball. They were originally going to do it with no spectators. Now it's completely canceled. The Masters, which is golf, which is not really, you don't really need the crowd noise or anything, but they have just postponed that indefinitely. And who knows when they're going to be able to play that. So, the XFL, the rest of the season is canceled. But the one thing is WrestleMania. Vince is holding on strong to that. And again, things are moving quickly, but I just don't see how they can hold it in that stadium with people flying all over the world, with the travel restrictions, and how fast this virus is growing right now. I mean, last week we had about when we're recording last Friday, we had like 300 cases, I believe, in the U.S. Now we're at 2,000. So it's I just don't see any way they go on with it. And whether that means postponing it, which I think makes the most sense. WrestleMania just brings in way too much money as far as merchandise. The attendance, they'd have to refund all those tickets. You're talking about, a $20 million week with WrestleMania week for WWE, and to just let that go and do it at the Performance Center. That's just, throwing all that money away in a sense.
Yeah. The thing about it is that you could postpone WrestleMania until whenever. Let's say they do WrestleMania in June or July. You could go ahead and do that. But Brian, you'd have to rebook WrestleMania, right? Because that's what really separates wrestling from everything else that's being canceled and kind of up in the air. Is you cancel an NBA game this weekend, you could play that game 4 months from now, and the stakes don't really change. But you can't just stop doing wrestling because it's going to be on every week. And this is where the kind of cliched comparison of wrestling being more soap opera than sport is really kind of apropos, because again, you've got to keep on telling these stories, and even if you push WrestleMania until the summer, you've got to do Brock Lesnar and Drew McIntyre. You got to pay that off. You got to pay off AJ Styles and The Undertaker and all of those. Those can't wait. So what do you do? Do you do a blow off on Raw to all of those in front of the Performance Center, and then again come up with a new lineup for WrestleMania in a few months? What do you think is the best of all their bad options?
Yeah, they really are all bad options. I mean, it is like a soap opera thing because if you had, I mean, soap operas don't do this, but let's say, a soap opera had kind of like a mega episode that was supposed to resolve all these issues. I mean, if they postpone that episode, well, the storylines still go on. So, right, because it's not like other things, it's its own thing. I think they would have to pick and choose, really. They would have to decide because I think some of the matches, I really kind of think they would sort of put them on hold and they might decide, okay, this storyline, we're going to sort of like reduce some of the heat on this and kind of like mix things up a little bit and then get back to that storyline because we do want to save it for WrestleMania. And maybe some things they'll decide to blow off sooner. Like, for example, with Brock and Drew McIntyre, they may decide, okay, we're going to kind of pump the brakes on that angle a little bit. Maybe we'll have someone else that we're going to feed to Brock in the meantime, just to kind of keep the wheels spinning because we want the big McIntyre moment to happen at WrestleMania. Like I could see that happening where some storylines will just slow down in order to still pay off at Mania. Maybe not all of them, but some of them.
Yeah. Raj, what do you make of WWE's kind of PR handling of this? I mean, as you touched on, it feels like everybody else in the world kind of immediately realized that the thing to do here is to put everything on hold. Financial considerations be damned. This is a lot more serious than that. Not surprisingly, I think every wrestling fan could have anticipated that Vince McMahon was not going to give in that easily. And sure enough, as of yesterday afternoon, I think WWE officials were meeting with folks from the city of Tampa Bay. And it looks like where they left things off was just give us another week. And I'm not sure what changes in a week. That said, to be fair to them, it could just be a matter of needing some time to put together a contingency and be able to appropriately address 80,000 ticket holders and all the logistics of having to change it. But again, it that doesn't seem to have been as much an issue for everyone else and every other organization, every other form of sports or entertainment that acted quickly. So do you think that leaves WWE looking bad, kind of maybe insensitive, not just to the health of their fans, but just sort of the to be considerate, the fact that folks have to cancel, myself included. I am a ticket holding WrestleMania goer, and you've got to cancel hotels, flights, all of that, and you need some time to do that.
Yeah, and I mean, we had a meetup during WrestleMania week that Friday that we canceled today, just because regardless if WrestleMania happens or not, we don't want anyone to get sick coming to meet us. So, real quick to your point earlier about the matches and if it gets postponed, how do you continue the storylines? I know John Cena would be one that you would have to blow off or just cancel immediately because he's got other movies coming up that he's going to start filming. So, he probably wouldn't be around or available in June. As far as WWE's response, they basically said in their statement that they are committed to putting the event on at the stadium, and it's up to the Tampa government officials if they want to cancel it. So they're basically saying, we're going to do it unless, someone else cancels it for us.
Right.
And, it's one of those things. WWE, as much as they are more, in a weird way, in the mainstream, even though they're less popular than they've ever been in my life, but they are more, not as sleazy as I guess it used to be when I was growing up, or as embarrassing. They can be covered by ESPN, Sports Illustrated, whereas they wouldn't before.
Yeah, and I think this is where you start to see sort of the carniness, really kind of
right.
Yeah, naked carniness come to the fore, because they could have all the IPOs they want, and they could be on ESPN and all that stuff. But at the heart of it, this is a carny business, and it's about, to be very blunt here, it's very often about fleecing marks, just as it was 100 years ago. And so they are not going to make these decisions unless the decisions are made for them. That is very much the case. I mean, look, not to get dark about this, but they had a performer die during a show live, and they kept the show going. So that tells you all you need to know. They're not going to pull the plug unless the plug is pulled for them, which I think is probably the way it's going to go down. They're not going to leave that money on the table. Impossible.
Yeah. And to that point, with the Saudi Arabia deal, I mean, they went forward with that show just a couple of weeks after that journalist Khashoggi was killed. So, and it didn't really, it still kind of flew under the radar. I mean, if you're a wrestling fan, you notice the press, but if you're not, it wasn't like a big story or anything. So it just kind of gets swept under the rug. When I'm watching ESPN right now and they're talking about all these cancellations, WrestleMania is not even mentioned.
And WrestleMania, I mean, there are a few events in the country, and I don't think it's an exaggeration, that pose the unique kind of threat that WrestleMania does, in that you have 80,000 people from WWE's own math, coming from whatever it is, 80, 90 countries around the world, all 50 states, all converging in one area. And now, as of the last, 10 years or so, it goes beyond that one day with all the different events going on, whether it's Access or the Hall of Fame or all the various independent shows there. There's just going to be this mix of folks from all over the world just moving all around the city. It seems like a uniquely bad situation. You touched on it. It's funny that for so long it's apparent that, and the XFL goes to this, that Vince McMahon for so long has tried to expand beyond just being a wrestling promoter, looking to be more legitimate, and has such disdain for even that term. And yet this is the most kind of pro wrestling thing that you could do, right? Is just as you touched on. I mean, you don't see Major League Baseball or the NBA or March Madness. What is a bigger deal than March Madness? And they just pulled the plug and didn't think twice about it. All that said, right, one difference is that WrestleMania is still a little bit further away than some of these other events. It's whatever it is now. We're less than a month. We're about 3 weeks. Raj, is there any possibility that this thing actually just goes off without a hitch? That they actually do WrestleMania in Raymond James Stadium with some amount of crowd, even if maybe some international fans can't be there and a lot of fans choose not to be there, the show actually does go on?
If it was UFC, I'd say absolutely not. It's WWE, and people I've spoken to, they believe that, and this is not confirmed, but they believe that there is a contract stipulation with this WrestleMania deal with the city of Tampa, when the host cities, when they negotiate these deals, that if they cancel the event, they're liable. That they got to pay X amount of dollars. As an insurance,
or the city of Tampa.
The city, yeah.
Okay.
Because they all bid for WrestleMania, and that's part of the guarantee. Like if they have to cancel it for any reason, now if WWE were to cancel it, then they wouldn't get that payment. That's just one rumor. That's one thing I've heard, and so it would be Vince wanting the city of Tampa to cancel it. With that being said, I wouldn't see why they don't just go ahead and do it unless the money is that big. But yeah, if it was UFC, I'd say 0% that it happens. With WrestleMania, I'd say it's 70% that it doesn't happen. It wouldn't completely surprise me if they went through with it, but if I was a betting man, I would say it's either postponed or moved.
How about, is it unthinkable that they actually go ahead with WrestleMania out of the Performance Center? And I mean, there's part of me, and I imagine a lot of wrestling fans, who would really like to see that just because how weird it would be, right? I mean, the thought of a WrestleMania in front of a few dozen people, I imagine largely WWE personnel, and I don't know if they hang up WrestleMania logos, the little pirate ship a sign all over the Performance Center, or it would just be so strange. And you think of those the images of wrestling. I mean, I think of my old classic WWF trading cards. I don't know if you had those, Brian. And they captured those iconic pictures of different WrestleManias, whether it's Hogan posing from the little moving cart at WrestleMania 3 in the Pontiac Silverdome, and we all see those aerial shots of the Pontiac Silverdome, or the Warriors celebrating in front of the Sky Dome. Imagine if for the rest of history, the images of WrestleMania 36 are in front of a few dozen fans at the Performance Center. Part of me would really like that.
Yeah,
Well,
I thought for a second, just for a second, I entertained the idea. Imagine if they did an empty arena WrestleMania. Now, like they did, they've had empty arena matches. What about an empty arena show? But then I thought, you know what? They'll never do that because the crowd is such a big
It's
part.
more than I think almost any of these
Yeah.
other forms of entertainment and sports. It's all the difference, right? I mean, it's a good match, a really good match, technically in execution, could be killed just by being in front of a dead crowd. We see that all the time. We saw it to some extent at the pay-per-view over the weekend. So to think of putting on these huge matches, but I think you could simulate some. I mean, it would almost be like in a WrestleMania on an indie level if you could do it in front of even a few dozen fans, but fans that were really excited, and maybe they're not really fans, maybe they're all paid personnel, but can you fill up the performance center, get a couple hundred people there? And again, in as much as they got to move these storylines along, I do wonder if whether that is the best scenario. And do you do WrestleMania 35.5 later this year at Raymond James Stadium?
Well, I think the novelty of the Performance Center is going to get old soon because already Monday's Raw is being moved to the Performance Center. Tonight's SmackDown's there. NXT now is moving out of Full Sail and will be held at the Performance Center. So it's going to be that same building, just with different signage, and maybe the lighting's a little different. I just see no benefit whatsoever of doing WrestleMania in an empty stadium or the Performance Center, because all you're getting out of it is some network subscriptions, and that's it. And we've kind of seen the network subscriptions are falling unless they have this big streaming deal that they've been talking about. They said that it would be announced by the end of this quarter. So far, no announcement. But if they had something like that where they had to do WrestleMania, like with an ESPN Plus, because they're paying so much for that event, then I see no reason why to do it, because you're not getting the gate, you're not getting the merch. Again, that's like a $20 million deal that is just being blown off for doing it at the Performance Center for maybe 100,000, 200,000 additional network subscribers will probably end up canceling after the show anyway, or a good percentage.
Yeah. And so much of WrestleMania these days, and we've talked about it here a lot, is the whole package, the atmosphere, because the reality is, this lineup isn't the greatest lineup, and you could put on a lot of these matches on a Raw or on a SmackDown, and they would seem perfectly appropriate. So it's not like in Hogan Andre, which people are dying to see so much that they would maybe take it in front of a smaller crowd because it's something you've got to see. Without the atmosphere, it would just be WrestleMania name, right?
Yeah. I mean, that's what always used to, get me excited, was just seeing the spectacle and the crowd and, the stadium and the fireworks and pageantry. And not having that, it's just, it's less than a house show.
Yeah.
As far as the gate goes, I mean, if this was still the time when they were, doing pay-per-view, the gate itself really, not to say that you want to just kind of throw that money away, but the gate itself became sort of an afterthought compared to what the pay-per-view take was. But I think now with the network and the structure of how it's set up, it's actually more important than it was in years past.
It's the one revenue stream they've got coming in. For WrestleMania.
Yeah, last year's WrestleMania was 12 million, just by the gate. And, you probably throw in a couple more million off of merch. And with their merch sales going down, again, with their stock taking a beating, it just matters so much.
Yeah, and there's Access, and there's Raw, and there's SmackDown, and there's NXT, and there's the Hall of Fame. I mean, all of those are extra revenue coming in, at least from the gate, and they're all out too. Why don't we talk a bit about the rest of the wrestling landscape? Again, SmackDown tonight moved to the Performance Center. Ring of Honor had a couple of big shows this weekend. Tonight was supposed to be their anniversary pay-per-view. In some ways, you feel for them most of all, because they've been struggling so much that they needed anything to kind of give them a little bit of boost. Not that there was a ton of heat behind this show, but I was interested to check it out. And it's out that, no word of any kind of rescheduling, and they just had canceled this week, and then another show they had, or tonight, and another show they had planned over the weekend. AW has already said the next couple of shows, including one I had tickets to, the Blood and Guts one in Newark, moved, I believe, to Jacksonville, basically in front of no or very few fans. Again, I forget what the word is, but it sounds like they're going to be doing it essentially in front of staff and maybe very limited fans. And New Japan, Canada, they were, I guess, the first domino drop, suspending the rest of the New Japan Cup. So, big picture, Raj, what does this do to the wrestling industry? Is this going to be something that will be hard for a lot of companies to recover from?
It's a big, for ROH, it's not going to be as hard because they are owned by Sinclair, a $1 billion corporation, so they can cancel these events. For instance, you were talking about the pay-per-view this weekend. It's in Las Vegas. They cancel those, but FSW, which is based out of Vegas, they're going through with their events because they can't afford to cancel it. Basically, unless they're forced to cancel it, a lot of these guys aren't going to. It really hurts them because when they, a lot of the wrestlers that they book are on a guarantee. So they still have to pay that. They still have to pay insurance and there's a lot of expenses. You can't just cancel and there's, it's no harm, no foul. They face a lot of expenses when they do cancel. So WrestleCon, if WrestleMania does end up getting moved or postponed, that's going to take a huge hit. The wrestling landscape could be completely different next year just based on these next couple of months and what happens with this coronavirus.
Yeah. And the other thing that is yet to happen, which you got to think is inevitable, is news of a confirmed case among a wrestler.
Right.
You just look, you see Tom Hanks, you see the Prime Minister of Canada's wife. It's starting to hit real notable people. And when it does, or we learn that it does, then that's kind of a whole other panic, right? Because few other forms of sports or art, I think, are as physical. You mentioned UFC, that would be one. But in terms of being able to exchange something from one person to another, again, it sounds like kind of a nightmare scenario, Brian.
Yeah, and I think that would sort of put a whole other layer on it. But again, it all comes down to like what we were talking about, how certain groups have more of a luxury than others. Like WWE, whether they want to admit it or not, and whether they want to leave money on the table or not, they could even shut down for a little while and they'll be okay. But this stuff can be the death of some indies. You could have people literally go out of business over this, or even just indie workers who will have to, kind of like, I don't know what, they'll have to rely on day jobs or sell their house or something. I know that sounds extreme, but for people that live paycheck to paycheck, just like a lot of non-wrestling people that live paycheck to paycheck or in the gig economy, you're talking about like financial catastrophe.
Yeah.
Even a company like Impact, they're owned by, $1 million corporation, but not $1 billion corporation. They can't afford to keep it going for that long without, with no crowds and people coming in. So this could have, serious effects.
They got ahead of the game by playing in front of empty crowds for years now, though. I kid. Before they get mad at me, that's a joke. Anyhow, I mentioned before, and this is not exactly in the wrestling space, but kind of related. The XFL announced that they're suspending the rest of their season. I don't know how much was left. They were about 5-6 weeks in, but you've got to think that. I don't know, it's a worst case scenario, but in terms of momentum, in terms of a hope to come back next year, what was the figure that was floated about how much money Vince McMahon was pumping into this? $300 million or something like that, to not even be able to finish off the season. It's got to be just devastating to him. And, I guess another kind of a part of that is does that make him more focused on the wrestling product now? Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing?
Part of the conspiracy theorist in me, I guess, well, not conspiracy theorist, but I almost wonder if it's better that the XFL had to shut down the remainder of the season because their ratings were falling so much each week. This past week they fell 16% from the week before. For the first time, they had 2 games that were under 1 million, well under 1 million, including one on ESPN, which was terrible for ESPN. And so if it was going to keep falling, And if it's settled, I mean, this past week was considered what the base would be. Like for them to make the network satisfied, this was the level, and they can't really go much below it. And if they continue to go below it, who knows if they would have gotten a TV deal next year. Now, next year they could say, hey, this is the numbers we were delivering. This is what we averaged. And it's probably higher average-wise than it would have been if they completed the season. And maybe they could get a better TV deal and, renegotiate these TV deals where they're not getting any revenue to where they are getting something. So I don't know if it's necessarily the worst thing. All they're missing is the gates for the next 5 weeks of the season. And, for how much they're putting in, what they need is a TV deal, and this might help them out.
So, Rod, what you're really telling us then is that you believe that Vince McMahon unleashed the coronavirus in order to save the XFL. Okay.
Did we ever find out why Vince was in China last December?
Nice. Yes, that's true.
Yeah. Well, I think we've exhausted the topic. I'll go around it and ask. I guess in this sense, as far as WrestleMania, Brian, what do you think is going to happen? What is your prediction of how this all plays out in the next week and the next several weeks?
This is a tough call because look, and I know some people have given me hell over this, but I'm one of these people that I'm not horrified by the virus. I'm horrified by the reaction to it. I really think that it is just. I mean, it's one of those things where social media has created kind of this escalating level of panic and hysteria to the point where I think a lot of these businesses and things are closing mainly out of like a sense of pressure. Like, I don't want to be the guy who's open and then everybody's looking at me as being irresponsible. Like, I think that it's just this escalating thing that's now out of control. So it's hard to predict because even a week ago I would have said, oh, this is going to be forgotten in a couple of days. Now, having said that, I am on the optimistic side, and I tend to think, and I may put my foot in my mouth here, that within a couple of weeks, this thing is going to start to seriously die down as a perceived threat. So I'm being optimistic, and I'm saying that I think that WrestleMania just may squeak by in that time frame. Unless, like we discussed, the city of Tampa kind of steps in and makes a decision for them. But if things just stay as they are and it's left up to WWE, I think by the time WrestleMania happens, things may have calmed down to the degree that they can actually pull it off.
But that's incredibly likely that the Tampa is going to shut them down, right? And understanding what Raj said, which makes a lot of sense, that WWE would sooner wait on Tampa to do it and then maybe hold them liable. Versus doing it themselves and end up with nothing. But I just can't imagine. If you hear a lot of the experts, what they say is we are still at the very beginning of this, right? So yes, WrestleMania is 2 weeks away, 3 weeks away, whatever it is, a month away. But it's going to continue to escalate. The cases will continue to go up and not down, especially as we do more and more testing. So what was the figure that I think in South Korea they were testing something like 11,000 people a day, and nationwide in the United States until now they've tested something like 10,000 people. And so I think in the next week or so is when you're going to see a big ramp up in those tests. I know the governor of New York here today said that they're going to go from being able to test a couple hundred people a day to a couple thousand. And what will happen with those is that the numbers are going to go way, way up. And so I just can't see this being in the past already in 3 weeks' time. Now, that said, China seems to kind of have gotten over that hump already. And I think some of these makeshift hospitals that they built are starting to close. Life is just beginning now to get back somewhat to normal. And now it's really shifted to Europe, Italy. That seems to be the real kind of concentration of where the real crisis is happening right now. But if we are on that same trajectory, again, I feel like it's going to get considerably worse before it gets better. And certainly in 3 weeks' time, I just can't see this being resolved. So I don't know.
I'm going to put my cards on the table here, Alan. I'm just going to say that part of my motivation for feeling this way is that I am going to the Cauliflower Alley Club reunion at the end of April in Las Vegas.
Sure you are.
And nothing is going to I will walk there if I have to. So I am taking a very optimistic attitude out of very self-serving motivations.
Yeah. Raj, again, sort of prediction. What do you think happens here? No WrestleMania, a postponed WrestleMania, a much smaller WrestleMania. I joke about the Performance Center, but is there a potential even to move it to another state, maybe where there isn't as much a panic, and hold it in kind of a mid-sized arena somewhere?
I mean, those seem like the most obvious responses to me would be to move it. I know a lot of people are joking about Saudi Arabia, but I'm sure they would throw that money out there to have WrestleMania there.
Oh gosh.
But to what you were saying earlier about China, their first 3 weeks, I mean, they went from a few hundred to 70,000. And then it kind of leveled off. And now we were only seeing like 20, 30 new cases per day. They do have like 80,000 cases right now, but it has slowed down. So if Vince is banking on that, like this is going to grow for the next couple of weeks and then level off. And if it levels off, he could say, hey, this thing is under control, so we could go ahead and have WrestleMania. I could almost see that being part of his mindset, is just waiting to see once this thing levels off, and if it does it in time, that they could go ahead and still hold it in Tampa. But I don't think the Tampa officials would let it get there. So my prediction would be that it gets postponed.
And you do WrestleMania in June, maybe something like that, back at Tampa.
They're saying that the hot weather, a lot of experts are predicting that the hot weather would hurt a virus like this, so this wouldn't last, so this would die off. So and we don't know yet, but if that's the case, then a summer WrestleMania, makes sense, and that's what a lot of people are doing, is postponing, a few months out. So
yeah,
that would be my guess.
My prediction, I'm going to kind of go out on a limb here, is that they are going to put on WrestleMania on that date, whatever it is, April 5th, is it? I forget, whatever it is, in some form, somewhere. I don't think it's going to be in the stadium, unless they do an empty stadium WrestleMania. I mean, that would be so extra bizarre. But I guess they'd be able to do the pyro at least. That way you're not getting pyro inside the Performance Center, I suppose. But I don't see, I guess the word that came out yesterday is that the city would make an official decision in 7 days, and the wording of the statement was essentially, we're going to give WWE a week to figure this out, and then in 7 days we're going to make our decision. We're going to make our announcement. Again, I can't imagine this being any better or significantly better in a week. So I do feel pretty confident that the city of Tampa is going to cancel WrestleMania inside the stadium there. But again, I mean, 40 years almost of following the McMahon family, I just don't see them being deterred. And I think a little bit of a different situation, but remember back to WrestleMania 7 at originally booked for the Coliseum in LA. They claimed it was security. A lot of people have theory that it was less about security and more about ticket sales. But they did scramble in those last few days and moved it to the sports arena in LA. I wonder if they do something like that here. Again, you look at the map, you find maybe a state that hasn't had the spread. It's been more contained. And you do, whatever, WrestleMania in, I don't know, Idaho.
I do got to say, with WrestleMania 7, though, when they did move it to the arena from the Coliseum, they still didn't have that many tickets sold. So they didn't have to refund any tickets for it. And they did have a few months when they made that decision. So they would have to be refunding a lot of tickets if they did move it.
Yeah, I just don't know if I don't know. I think, and part of it goes to Vince McMahon's personality, and again, this feeling that nobody's going to tell me what to do. I feel like by hook or by crook, they're going to try to put on that show. Maybe they do something else for Tampa later in the year. Do they go back to Raymond James for something else? I don't know what it is. SummerSlam's already booked. I don't know. Do you do a Super Showdown special from Raymond James Stadium? I don't know. But I feel like their whole year is built about, and the other thing is there's the Wall Street side of this, right? And the Wall Street side of this and the importance of WrestleMania happening on that day in that quarter of their financial year. But again, as you touched on, what would be the financial benefit to them to put it on, other than they said they did, if there's very little revenue coming in and they're going to have to put a whole lot out in the way of refunds. So I don't know. I kind of going back and forth on this, but my gut is that there will be a WrestleMania on that weekend in some shape or form.
Yeah, I think that's a safe bet. I mean, they will figure out a way. Like you said, Vince is not one to follow anybody's lead. I mean, God, they'll have it in his office if they have it. with him just kind of sitting there, just providing all the crowd noise. Just like, come on, that'll be.
Yeah. Anyhow, thanks, guys. This was a fun, insightful. Raj, you were the right person to have on, so I'm glad you could jump on the phone with us at relatively short notice to do this. Brian, thanks so much. As always, certainly follow WrestlingInc.com for all the latest updates on this. Raj and his team do a terrific job over there. So if you want to stay up to date with what's going on, go check out his site. As for us, we will be back soon. Again, check us out at PWI-online.com. And thanks for listening.